It is a great honor to welcome Professor Nigel Biggar on the show. He is an Anglican priest, theologian, and ethicist. He has served as the professor of theology at Oxford University, and he recently authored a book titled Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. How are you today, Nigel? Thank you for joining the show.
I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
So, first question, we are conversing on the 4th of July, which in America, they made a holiday out of it because it's the anniversary of the American War of Independence, which you guys, the Brits, fought. So how does the 4th of July and the American War for Independence play into British historiography?
Well, I just finished reading Andrew Roberts' excellent biography of George III. Of course, in the traditional American narrative, George III is the villain who wanted to become a tyrant. Roberts's view of George III, and I think it's convincing, is that that was just not true. But it is true that some American colonists had come to the place where they wanted to rule themselves, and they told a story about George III that justified that. But the role of the American War of Independence in the history of the British Empire is important because it was because of that the British realized that they couldn't keep tight control over far-flung parts of their empire. And so that's why in the 19th century, in the second half, starting with Canada and then Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, all increasingly became autonomous within what became the British Commonwealth of Nations.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the role, the kind of educative role that the American War of Independence played in the history of the empire.
So your book focuses a lot on the British Empire, and it is also a part of, if I get this correctly, the Ethics and Empire project, which is still ongoing. So why don't you tell us about that project?
So the book is not strictly part of it. The Ethics and Empire project is separate, although it has informed my writing, of course. So the Ethics and Empire project was set up in 2017 by John Darwin and myself, John Darwin being a very eminent historian of empire. And the project aimed to look at how people throughout history have regarded empire morally. So how did the ancient Chinese regard ancient Chinese empire? How did medieval Muslims regard Arab empire morally, etc.? And so we ran five annual conferences between 2017 and June of this year, and the project is now complete. But it was never designed to defend the British Empire, as some of my critics still seem to think. It was designed to view how people through history have regarded empire morally. And one thing we learned early on was, if you're looking for a critique of empire in ancient China or the medieval Muslim world, or even up to the early modern period, you won't find it. What you will find are treatises on what makes for a good and bad emperor, what makes for the virtue and vice of a ruler. But empire as a political form, it seems, was regarded as completely unremarkable.
Mm-hmm. So what would be the intended audience for your recent book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning?
The intended audience is a general reading public. I mean, there's a lot of. I'm an academic, but I'm told this book is readable. One or two people have reported it's a page turner, so it's accessible. It's full of historical detail, but there's an argument running through it, and I think what I'm doing is clear enough. So it's a general public. It's not aimed at specialist historians or academics. And I'm aiming it at the general public, certainly in the UK, but also elsewhere in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and wherever, because it seems to me that there is at the moment prevailing a story about European colonialism and British colonialism in particular that is very distorted, relentlessly negative, and untrue to the facts of the past.
Mhm. Right. And I can report myself, having read parts of the book, that it is highly readable and highly fascinating. I'm a big fan of history, so there's that too.
That warms my heart.
So, nevertheless, the British Empire does have a bad rep around the world in that many founding stories and mythologies of other nations, not just the United States of America, have painted the empire as the big bad villain, namely because Britain has imprinted its mark on almost every corner of the globe. Obviously, Canada and Australia has their stories about the British Empire, but so does Ireland and India and many Middle Eastern countries, including both Israel and Palestine, China too, among others, South Africa included. So I'm supposing the purpose of your book is to say that, well, the British Empire isn't that bad. Would that be a correct statement?
Not quite. I mean, the story I tell is that the British Empire contained some very bad stuff, but also some very good stuff. And at the end of the book, in the conclusion, I try and explain how one could come to an overall judgment about it. But my basic aim is to say, yes, there was bad stuff. So yes, there was, for example, 150 plus years of slave trading and slavery between Africa and the West Indies and the eastern seaboard of North America. Yes, there was the unjustifiable bombardment of Canton in China in 1839. Yes, there was the unjustifiable massacre of unarmed civilians in Amritsar in India in 1919, and I could go on. But my view is that any long-standing state will chalk up bad things, and that applies even to not so very long-standing post-colonial states. Let's say Zimbabwe, for example, the record of Robert Mugabe is not exactly squeaky clean. Mm-hmm. So any long-standing state will chalk up bad stuff. But then I wanted to say, well, let's not neglect the good stuff, because yes, if Britain was involved in slave trading and slavery for 150 years, it was also among the first states in the world's history to abolish both, and then Britain led the world in suppressing slavery from Brazil, across the Atlantic, Africa, India to Malaysia. I say, at its end, the British Empire committed itself to opposing the massively murderous racist regime in Berlin, in Nazi Berlin, and between May 1940, when France fell, and June 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, the British Empire offered the only military resistance to Nazism, with the exception of Greece. So I want to say there's a debit column, there's also a credit column.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I suppose the fervor in opposition to the British Empire and imperialism in general, I think, starts with Brexit, really. And there's a whole strain of, I guess, English nationalism that includes both Enoch Powell and the current British Brexit movement. And so I think what to the best of my understanding, whenever British people voices claims of, well, we are Britons, we should rule our nations, we should rule our own nation instead of, say, Europeans or people of foreign lands, those whose countries and territories used to be ruled by the empire would say that, well, you went around and ruled us. So one notable episode would be when Enoch Powell voices his Rivers of Blood speech, and the great Indian writer V.S. Naipaul told him that, well, we weren't here in the UK if you weren't there, as in India. So how does British nationalism, I guess, compare with these claims?
Well, first of all, I myself don't think that Brexit was fueled by imperial nostalgia. Just for the record, I voted to remain, not to leave. I mean, I know a lot of people say that it was all about imperial nostalgia. I don't think that at all. I think it was much more about people wanting to be in control of their own political destiny. So yes, I quite understand why Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, African peoples eventually wanted to rule themselves. There was a strain, as I said early on in answer to your first question, there was a strain, a growing strain, a liberal strain, if you like, in British thought about the empire, that it would eventually have to relax into a loose alliance of sympathetic independent nation states. So in the 1820s, the three big port cities in India that the East India Company had built up, Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, were all governed by Scotsmen. And every one of the Scotsmen can be found to say to his fellow Britons, we cannot be here forever. We can't rule India forever. All we can do is hope to enable Indians to rule themselves sufficiently decently, and then we leave with grace and we hope goodwill. And so by 1930, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa were virtually independent. After the First World War, India was on the same track. Yes, there were tensions, because once you gain power, you don't really want to leave go of it. So some people wanted to hang on to British imperial power longer. Some people argued that it was in the interests of native peoples for the British to stay longer. And I suspect some people would look upon the fate of post-colonial Africa and think that maybe actually the interests of native peoples might have been served better had the British not left so quickly. So were it the case that the British Empire was all about holding on to territory come what may, then I would agree that that was unsupportable. But actually, it wasn't like that.
So, what are some of the claims made by the detractors of yourself and the book that you would more likely concede to, and what are some of your counterpoints? Your go-to counterpoints to their detractions.
Yeah. Your first point, what would I concede? The books attracted some very positive reviews and some very hostile ones, given my position and given the climate. I had to expect some very hostile reviews. I responded to 3 of the hostile reviews in print. The longest review essay by an historian at the University of Sussex was published in the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History this month, or last month rather, in June, and it ran to 15,000 words, in which the reviewer had nothing good to say about my book. I then wrote a 14,500 word response. At the end of my response, you will see that I conceded 3 minor points of detail, but on the whole, I think my book stood up very well. I mean, some of my detractors say I whitewash the empire. I think that's simply untrue. I mean, I'm quite clear about the horrors of slavery. I'm quite clear about the unjustifiability of the bombardment of Canton. I'm quite clear about the unjustifiability of the ruthless revenge taken by some Britons on Indian mutineers in 1857, etc. So I'm not, I don't skate over the bad stuff. So I think the accusation of whitewashing is simply untrue. In fact, one reader wrote to me yesterday to say that it wasn't until I read your book that I realized how bad it was. So I think that's simply unfair. An accusation made is that I downplay racism, that racism was universal and prevalent. To which my response is, well, I don't downplay it. I discuss it. I devote a chapter to it. And one thing I do is to say we need to analyze what we mean by racism. And I myself distinguish between racial against just because of the color of their skin and patronizing behavior. One can be patronizing to all sorts of people regardless of skin color. And I also distinguish between kind of general disdain for non-white races from biological racism, which has it that white races are forever superior and non-white races are naturally, biologically, scientifically inferior. And I say that in the British Empire, although in the late 19th century, scientific racism did gain some traction, it never displaced the earlier Christian conviction that all human beings are equal under God, regardless of race and regardless of their stage of cultural development. So I think the story of race in the empire is quite complicated, and I try and display and analyze the complications.
So you wrote in the preface of the book, as well as a piece on compact.com, that the book had a pretty difficult time getting published. I think one notable detail being that the initial publisher, Bloomsbury, promised to publish it and then didn't. And so I suppose you're welcome to relay the story to us. But my question now is, had the book been conceived of and published, say, 10 years ago, would the publication process be less difficult?
Okay, well, I won't tell the story unless you want me to. Those listening can Google Nigel Biggar compact, the anatomy of a cancellation, and they can read the story for themselves. No, I think 10 years ago, there was none of this hypersensitivity about this topic. And in fact, I'm in the current climate, some on the left like to describe me as being extreme right, because simply because I hold that the British Empire contained good as well as bad, and actually that it contained significant and growing humanitarian and liberal impulses. That makes me extreme right. This is crazy, because if you read Neil Ferguson's book Empire, which was published in 2003, now Neil leans to the right politically, but his book is a pretty measured, even-handed account of British Empire, which again doesn't skate over the bad stuff, the evil stuff, the injustices. My book is not really very different from his in terms of my position. But then, if you read Bernard Porter's book, Bernard Porter is a historian of the British Empire who leans to the left. And he wrote a book, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, called British Imperial, What the Empire Wasn't. And even though he leans to the left, his book tells a story that is not very different from mine. So my position is actually a moderate and even-handed one. And if I took care before I published the book to get about 10 historians to write pre-publication commendations, and people like Vernon Bogdanor and Tirthankar Roy, the Bengali-born economic historian at the LSE in London, and Krishan Kumar, University of Virginia. All of them use words like balanced and moderate and even-handed and rigorous of my book. So 10 years ago, this would have been really unremarkable, but something's happened in the last 6 years, so that views like mine that would have been regarded as frankly, common sense 10 years ago are now regarded as extreme. And I have some idea as to why that's happened.
Mhm. Perhaps what's changed is what your detractors and critics may call a moral reckoning, in reference to the title of your book, in that they believe that there are certain phenomena such as British imperialism, as well as certain individuals involved in the project, say Cecil Rhodes and Winston Churchill, are now being repudiated because of what they've done, which may have been morally okay at that time, but nowadays is morally unacceptable. But I think this opens up a broader discussion on how, certain individuals who lived in the past, whose actions may be morally acceptable, but now we view as morally abhorrent. Certainly, anyone who's ever owned slaves or have been involved in the slave trade. So, as an ethicist, how would you square this particular circle?
I think the short answer really is with a large dose of humility when we come to judge the past. So first of all, let's just take slavery. We regard slavery as abhorrent. But when we look at the past, we have to reckon with the fact that slavery in one form or another was a universal institution that can be found on every continent and was practiced by people of every skin color. And we have to reckon with the fact that when black slaves escaped from plantations in Jamaica in the 1700s and fled to the mountainous forested interior of the island, some of them kept black slaves of their own. Toussaint Louverture, the famous leader of the slave revolt in what became Haiti, for a period, even kept slaves of his own. So this was a very common practice, and that may shock us, but we have to try and understand why it was so universal. And then that, I think, will temper our judgment somewhat. So I think we have to remember the difference of the past, and we have to try and understand it. It wasn't just that they were bad people. It was that their circumstances were so different from ours. And when I talk about we, I'm thinking we in Western Europe, you in Vienna, me in Oxford. We live in parts of the world right now that enjoy, historically speaking, levels of wealth and health and peace that are unprecedented in our own history and unprecedented in the history of the world. And we live in pretty strong states, and strong states can afford to be very careful about the use of armed force. Most of the world, most of the time, has not enjoyed that kind of security, and in insecure times and places, recourse to armed force is much more common and actually much more justifiable. But again, we need to step out of our own context and just realize how different the past was. And it's not just, you referred earlier to Rhodes and Churchill, being men of their time, and now we judge them differently because we think differently. I'm not sure that's quite right, really. I mean, I think it's no news that Cecil Rhodes was a morally ambiguous figure. He was controversial 100 years ago. And it's no news that Churchill had made sometimes racially disparaging remarks about Gandhi. But the claim now is being made that Churchill was responsible for the Bengal famine. And in my book, I show, I think, that is just completely untrue. So there are a lot of things being said about Churchill and about the British Empire, and even about Rhodes. Rhodes was being touted as South Africa's Hitler, which is complete nonsense. So some of the anti-colonial fervor is being fueled by untruths, things that are just not true about the past. And one thing I found most puzzling is, I'm perfectly willing to believe that, or to be persuaded that what I think is mistaken. I'm willing to, I won't give up easily, but I'm willing to believe I'm mistaken. But what's odd is the reaction of some of those on the left, of the anti-colonialists, the decolonizers. When I say things, that they don't respond with skepticism or skeptical curiosity as to, Biggar, why do you think that? And here's why I think you're wrong. They don't respond with argument. They respond with aggression and with abuse, and that puzzles me. Because there's clearly on their part, their view is something in which they are wholly invested, and they will not tolerate the suggestion they might be mistaken. And I don't understand, what's going on psychologically here.
I see. So a little bit of background. I'm originally from Vietnam, so we were colonized by the French, not the British. So my views on the British Empire are pretty much from documents from both you and as well as your detractors. So I think if I can, so what I'm trying to do is summarize their arguments in a way that's that is fair to them as well as to you. So I suppose whenever I think about the British Empire, my mind immediately comes to Rudyard Kipling and his poem "The White Man's Burden." It's written in the wake of the U.S.-Philippines War, but the attitude itself, it kind of summarizes, I guess, the British colonialist attitude in some ways, at least in my reading, as well as the readings of certain post-colonial scholars and philosophers. To quote the poem, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need." And that, as well as the entire poem, evokes a kind of moral superiority, at least in my reading, that, well, the British are enlightened people, we are the civilized people, and these people whom we've encountered in our sojourns across the world are uncivilized and less than civilized, and it's our job as white men, so to speak, to civilize these non-white people. So how would you respond to that?
Well, you're quite right to put your finger on that, because that's a really crucial issue. So one thing I'd say is, to put it very bluntly, being patronized can be unpleasant. It's better than being raped. So if you are patronizing good doers or do-gooders as your rulers, then you're better off than a lot of people. Yes. So were the British and the Europeans sometimes arrogant and dismissive of native cultures? Yes, they were. Were they always arrogant and dismissive? No, they weren't. It was British Orientalists, officers of the East India Company, who rescued, for example, ancient Sanskrit culture and monuments from oblivion, because they were fast. They discovered them, they translated them, they restored them, they protected them. And in the eyes of Niraj Chowdhury, who was the rather eccentric Indian man of letters, who ended up living in Oxford, the eyes of Niraj Chowdhury, in a sense, the British Orientalists of the 18th century fueled the Hindu nationalist myth that there was this original Hindu civilization that was equal to Europe. So ironically, the Orientalists fed Indian nationalism, but it was the British who, through fascination with ancient Hindu culture, rescued it. So contempt was not universal. On the other hand, Did native peoples resent what the Europeans brought to them? Yes, sometimes they did. But then views among natives would have differed. So Arab slave traders would have resented British interference with the slave trade. Presumably Africans who were enslaved didn't. Kikuyu tribesmen in Kenya in the 1930s, 40s, 50s resented Christian missionaries objecting to female circumcision. Presumably, lots of the African young women didn't object. And then in 1823, the East India Company wanted to fund a Hindu college in India where classical Sanskrit learning would be learnt and promoted. And an Indian social reformer, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, wrote to Lord Amherst, the Governor General, and he said, we don't need more benighted Sanskrit learning. We in India need English language and exposure to European science. Now, Roy was not entirely happy with being ruled by white men. He understood the sense of humiliation, I guess. On the other hand, he was sufficiently discriminate to recognize that some things Europeans brought was actually superior. European science versus whatever science Hindu philosophy had produced. I think that there's truth. There's certainly truth in the view that Europeans were sometimes arrogant and dismissive. There's also truth that native peoples found what Europeans brought often attractive and valuable.
Mm-hmm. I think another great literary work that deals with the imperialism in general is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which I think is a direct response to Kipling in some ways, in that in the novella, Captain Kurtz, who's I think he's sent from Belgium in their colonization of the Congo, which at the time was deemed vicious and cruel even by fellow imperialists, British and French and etc. at that time. And I suppose my reading of Heart of Darkness shows that rather than being the civilized peoples coming to, I guess, spread civilization and enlightenment to the uncivilized peoples, the imperial project barbarizes, or at least makes barbarians out these so-called civilized people too, in the particular cruelty of Captain Kurtz. So I suppose it's not really a common line of attack against British imperialism now, but it certainly is in a moral aspect.
Yeah. So first of all, I just underline this is a work of fiction. Secondly, it was inspired by the Belgian Congo, which was it wasn't actually owned by the Belgian state. It was a private fiefdom of King Leopold, and that was and is recognized to be one of the worst instances of colonial exploitation. Third thing to say is don't take that as typical, and don't talk of the colonial project, because that implies there was a single thing that the project was about. It implies that, let's say, someone woke up in London one sunny morning and said, "Ooh, let's go conquer the world because we like conquering people." It was never like that. It was much more ad hoc, responsive to events and circumstances, sometimes about trade, sometimes about people fleeing famine in the British Isles, wanting a better life in North America, sometimes people being sentenced to transportation to Australia because transportation was regarded as more humane than hanging. Sometimes British governments giving in to lobbying by humanitarians in London to interfere with the Arab slave trade, sometimes the results of the excellence of war. So there was no project. It was acquired and maintained for a whole variety of reasons. But yes, I mean, sometimes colonists behaved barbarically, particularly, I think, where you have settlers in North America or Australia encountering native peoples where there is no colonial government to control the encounter. So you get two peoples of vastly different cultures, don't speak the language, don't understand each other, one seeking a better life, the other resenting land being trespassed upon. And what do you get? You get conflict, and you get fear, and you get what one side regards as a massacre, and that produces horror and indignation and hatred in the other, and you get unconstrained warfare. So yes, sometimes the encounter made Europeans barbaric. Does that mean that everything the Europeans did was barbaric? No, it wasn't. Did that mean that the so-called white man's burden was just a pretext for exploitation? No, it didn't. I mean, there were genuine idealists who wanted to serve native peoples, and Marjorie Perham, the expert on British colonial Africa, flourished in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. She spoke of the British Empire in Africa as undergoing what she called a progression in virtue. And so if you speak to, and I have done recently, if you speak to colonial civil servants in the 1950s and 60s, and if you read, there's a book by a Sudanese and an American about the colonial service in the Sudan after the Second World War, the relationship between colonial officer and native African is often described in terms of love, and that's not inappropriate. And I record that in my book.
I think one of the sentiments that I often heard from both Ferguson and also Andrew Roberts, and I forget who originally evoked this, in that so Gandhi's movement for independence would not have succeeded had the empire he was rebelling against wasn't the British. And one can see that during the national liberation movements, the Britons are the ones who, I guess, who are less reluctant, so to speak, to let go of their former colonies, namely India. Compare that with the French and the Germans. British Empire certainly stands out above the rest. So what can you say about that?
Yeah, so the idea that native people should be involved in colonial government, particularly in India, was long established. So you have Indians involved in all levels of government, including playing judges, before the end of the 19th century. And the reason for that was, and this applies to Africa too, the ratio of Britain to native people was just vast. I mean, in 1900, there were 300 million Indians and 164,000 Britons of all kinds, military, civilian. So what that tells you is that the British Empire, colonial government could not have got off the ground and could not have continued without widespread consent from native peoples. No doubt the consent was more or less reluctant or more or less voluntary, but it was consent. As I said, by 1930, all the main so-called white settler colonies, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, were virtually independent, apart from, I think, certain defence arrangements. And India was formally on the same track from 1919. So it was understood India would become independent. The only and from, I think, about 1920, in 1920 or thereabouts, the Colonial Office declared that, made it quite clear that colonial government of African colonies was to be in the interests of Africans. The only question was how fast independence would come. And in each case, I think in India, it probably came at the right time, because Indians were well equipped to govern themselves, and they've been involved in colonial government for a century. But it is notable that during the Second World War, Indian volunteers probably provided most of the empire's military manpower. Most of them fought in India, some in Europe. My father fought next an Indian division in Italy. Why did Indians volunteer to fight? Well, people volunteered to fight for all sorts of reasons, but it wasn't because they wanted the British to stay forever. It was partly because they'd read about the behavior of the Japanese in Manchuria and Nanjing, the massacre of Nanjing, and they recognized that however irritated they were by the British, the Japanese were a whole lot worse. But it was also because, I mean, many of the Indians who fought in British uniform in Burma and India in the 1940s were nationalists. They wanted to be able to rule India through the institutions that the British had built. But for India, the time for self-rule had come. In Africa, I mean, yes, I mean, I think the British recognised that that they couldn't, well, unless they were willing to pour troops in and hold down hostile populations. There was no realistic prospect of holding on to these colonies. And besides, I think many Britons thought, well, why would you do that? Independence was ceded to African colonies west and east mainly in the 1960s. I think in the judgment of many people at the time, and probably many people now, ideally, British colonial government would have carried on longer, so that African elites could have been, as it were, inducted more gradually. But under the circumstances prevailing at the end of the Second World War, Britain didn't have the resources or the will, and there was American pressure to surrender the empire and internal nationalist pressure to do so too. So it had to be done. It was necessary. Whether the native peoples of African countries were best served by such a precipitate change, I think, is in doubt.
I think in an interview you did with Jordan Peterson, you mentioned that you lived through the worst period of violence in Northern Ireland, which brings me to the question of the British's involvement in Ireland itself, and that I think today there's still like pretty fervent sentiment against British imperialism within like Irish political discourse, no doubt fueled by Irish nationalism. So how would you set the record straight on the British in Ireland?
Yeah, so I think Ireland probably was one of the worst instances of British imperial rule. I mean, the British interest in Ireland was mainly security, because Ireland served as the back door to invasion from France, let's say, during the Napoleonic period. Also, during the period of religious wars in Europe, Catholic versus Protestant, England became Protestant, Ireland remained Catholic. and because ever since the Pope declared Queen Elizabeth I as a heretic and liable for assassination, Catholics then became political threats to Protestant England. So the English and then the British, when Britain was created in 1707, regarded Ireland mainly in security terms. It wasn't interested particularly in investment. There was in the 1600s, 1500s, Protestants were planted in Ulster and in Cork. Land was the issue there, so land was taken. Although land was taken from the big chiefs who were displaced. Often in Ulster, Catholic tenants remained on the land, so it wasn't simply displacement of Catholics by Protestants, but certainly there was displacement. But what can be said in mitigation? Well, by the end of the 1700s, particularly when secular Napoleonic France became the main threat, and actually Catholics found themselves on the wrong end. French Catholics found themselves on the wrong end of Napoleonic France, and Britain opposed Napoleonic France, and found themselves, the British found themselves in a sense allied to Catholics in their opposition to secularist Republican France. That point, pressure built to lift all the penalties that Catholics in Ireland were subject to. It took longer than some wanted, but in 1829 there was Catholic emancipation. Catholics were in Ireland and Britain were allowed into the armed forces and allowed to take public office. The Irish famine, highly controversial. Was it genocide? No, it wasn't. It wasn't. No Briton intended to annihilate the Irish people. It was because of the failure of the potato crop, and because Irish peasants depended entirely on potatoes. They had no alternative. Was London government unresponsive to the tragedy developing in Ireland? No, it wasn't. It provided forms of relief. Was the relief it provided enough? No, it wasn't. Was government perhaps too niggardly in the relief it offered? Yes, perhaps it was. But it wasn't an attempt at genocide. And then in the course of the 19th century, by about 1900, most of the, partly because Ireland sent 100 MPs to the Parliament in Westminster, about 15% of MPs in Westminster were Irish. They were able to exercise political pressure, and by the end of the 1800s, most of the major sources of Irish grievance, including land tenure, had been addressed. And the reason that Pádraig Pearse and other revolutionaries in 1916 launched their famous Easter Rebellion, the reason was that they perceived that Irish people were becoming too content with the union with Great Britain, and they wanted to provoke the British into a reaction that would, as it were, create division and create the will to become independent of Britain. And their violence, combined with the draconian response of General Maxwell in summarily executing the leaders of the rebellion, actually played into the revolutionaries' hands, and that's why in 1922 Ireland became independent. But I think actually by 1900 most of the major grievances had been addressed. So that's one thing about the British Empire, is that although it may have taken time, there were institutions, parliamentary institutions, for example, the free press, that enabled the empire to be self-correcting. So it did change in response to Irish grievances.
I think another fault line, so to speak, in the history of British colonialism / imperialism is what we now perceive today as the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I think both peoples can agree that the British were at fault in some ways in, I guess, initiating the conflict, although the Palestinians and the Arabs would say that, well, that's because after the Second World War, too much land was ceded to the Jews and the Zionists, and the Zionists would say that the British failed to fulfill Lord Balfour's declaration. So, what is the British Empire's record in regards to this particular region?
Yeah, so I devote a section of one of my chapters to this. My view is, let me make clear, just for the avoidance of doubt, I believe that the state of Israel has a right to exist now. Whatever its origins, it has a right to exist because it is a sufficiently just, democratic, liberal state. Even though I disagree fiercely with its policy of settlements on the West Bank. But in terms of its origins, so on the one hand, Arabs believe, and many others believe, that in 1915 the British promised the Arabs that Palestine would be part of a new Arab state that would be built on the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. Now, I've considered this, and in particular, I've read Eli Kuduri's analysis of this issue in his book, The Anglo-Arab Labyrinth, and I think it's not true that the British promised Palestine to the Arabs. I think it's ambiguous. So there's that. On the other hand, yes, Balfour persuaded the British cabinet to put imperial power behind the creation of a Jewish homeland. The nature of the homeland was left ambiguous. It was explicitly to be without prejudice to the civil and religious rights of Arab people. But that doesn't make any commitment to Arab political rights. So it was ambiguous. And then during the mandate after the Second World War, the British supervised the immigration of Jews, and the rate of immigration provoked reaction from Arabs, eventually violent, in the 1930s. And the British tried to find various solutions. The possibility of some kind of Jewish autonomous region within a larger Arab state was one proposal. Another proposal was 2 states within some larger federation. So various permutations were tried, but none of them would satisfy both Jews and Arabs. And so eventually the British, after the Second World War, they upped and went, partly because I guess the UN voted in favor of the creation of a Jewish state, supported mainly by the US. The British abstained, and at that point they just said, well, there's nothing more we can do, and they left. Looking back, I think it was naive of the British cabinet to support Jewish immigration into Palestine. They didn't take account of the fact that most of the people of then Palestine were Arab. They presumed that the British could somehow oversee the peaceful settlement of Jews and Arabs together, and they devoted considerable resources. I think at one point there were well over 100,000 British troops in the small territory of Palestine trying to control it. So they overestimated the capacity for imperial control. I think in terms of intention, I think Balfour was genuinely moved by the story of a Jewish people exiled from its homeland and yearning for its return. I think from what I've read that probably was fantasy. I think lots of Jews weren't particularly interested in going back to Palestine, certainly not from civilized Europe. But there was a kind of good intention there. Yes, the British also thought that by supporting Zionism, they might be able to help keep Russia in the war against Germany, because this 1917, of course, was in the middle of the First World War. So I don't think, I don't think they were ill-intentioned. I think they were naive. And of course, after the 1930s and 40s with the Holocaust, the cause for Jewish people to be located in Israel, because America was not opening its borders to millions of Jews. The Jews had nowhere else to go if they were not going to stay in Europe. But the problem of what to do about Arab peoples who had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years was a problem then. It's a problem now. And it can't be solved without compromise. And there's no compromise on the horizon at the moment. So I think in answer to your question, I regard that as a mixture of well-meaningness, of good intentions, of naivety, and tragedy.
I think we should end on the history of how the abolition movement began, in that you've emphasized in many interviews that you've been in and I've listened to, that the abolition of slavery is possibly the British Empire's greatest moral triumph, so to speak. So what's the history behind this idea?
Okay, so my brief answer is I don't know as well as I want to, but certainly in the late 1700s, 1770 or thereabouts, the idea grows that slavery is morally intolerable. And there are two sources for this. The main source is non-conformist Christians, so you're talking about Quakers, Protestant non-conformists, and eventually evangelical Anglicans in Britain. And in 1774, John Wesley, the Anglican founder of what became Methodism, published a book called Treatise on Slavery, and it quotes the book of Genesis, where I think Cain, having murdered his brother Abel, addresses God and says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And the implication of the quotation is, yes, Cain, you are. And the implication of that is, yes, you white Britons, you are the keeper of your black African brothers. Therefore, you need to emancipate them. So there was that stream, and there's also an Enlightenment stream, I think, from France, according to which slavery is immoral, mainly because enslavement corrupts the slaver, which is an interesting argument, which is true, but it's not the emphasis we'd now put on the rights of the enslaved. So two streams of thought, and this then in England produces the creation of the Society for the Abolition of Slavery in 1787, comprised of evangelical Christians, middle class members of Parliament, and they lobby Parliament for 20 years to get the slave trade abolished. And this becomes actually a very popular movement, because at one point, some petitions, I think in 1801, presented to Parliament, carried the signatures of 20% of the total male population of the country. And this is long before Britain is fully democratic. And so in 1807, Parliament is persuaded to abolish the slave trade. The abolitionists, both white and black, and there were black abolitionists involved as well, including the escaped slave Olaudah Equiano. They thought that once the trade had been stopped and that plantations in the West Indies were no longer supplied by fresh slaves from Africa, that the business model would gradually become unviable and the plantations would naturally die. That didn't happen. And so in the 1820s, they created the Society for the Abolition of Slavery, and in 1833 persuaded the British Parliament to abolish slavery throughout the imperial territories. And from 1807 onwards, Britain used its imperial diplomatic and naval and military power to suppress slavery from Brazil across the Atlantic, Africa, Middle East, India to Malaysia. And in the 1820s and 30s, the Slave Trade Department was the largest unit in the British Foreign Office. And in 1840 or thereabouts, the Royal Navy committed 13% of its total manpower simply to stopping slave trading between West Africa and Brazil. So it was a major imperial commitment.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Professor Nigel Biggar, for joining the show.
Thanks for this chance to talk about something really interesting and really important.
So his book is Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. I would thoroughly recommend it. Thank you again, and take care.